It's the 1950s and we are zooming into Tehran. The calendar reads August 19th. It's just noon and people are going about their daily activities when suddenly the ground starts vibrating. Tanks are rolling toward the home of Iran's prime minister. His name is Mohammad Mossadegh. He's 71 years old, a Swiss-educated lawyer, an aristocrat, and right now he's the most dangerous man in the Middle East, at least according to Washington and London. He recently nationalized Iran's oil. He said the petroleum beneath Iranian soil should benefit Iranians, not British shareholders. The Brits didn't like that very much and they reported him to their American buddies. He is about to face the music. Outside his house, a mob is gathering, but these aren't ordinary protesters. Many of them were paid this morning. Cash handed out in South Tehran slums. Some of them don't even know why they are here. They were told to show up, chant against the government and break things. The money came from the CIA. By 5 p.m., Mossadegh's house is in ruins. His guards are dead or surrendered. The Prime Minister himself escapes over a garden wall in the chaos. He will be captured the next day, tried by a military court and sentenced to 3 years in prison.
Army officers reveal Mossadegh has surrendered. His reign as virtual dictator of Iran is ended.
He will spend the remaining 13 years of his life under house arrest. When he dies in 1967, the government won't allow a public funeral. To this day, Mohammad Mossadegh is buried inside his own home because the state refused him a public funeral. 2 days after this coup, this man returns from exile in Rome. His name is Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. He's the Shah of Iran and is about to begin a 26-year reign of absolute power, backed by American money, American weapons, and American trained secret police. When the Shah meets the CIA officer who orchestrated the coup, he reportedly tells him, quote, "I owe my throne to God, my people, my army, and to you." The whole operation cost less than $1 million. This is the day the United States made an enemy. 70 years later, Iran's currency has collapsed by 20,000-fold. 40% of the population now lives in poverty. Inflation is eating savings faster than people can spend them, and the regime that rules Iran today exists in large part because of what happened on August 19, 1953. This is the story of how America broke Iran. For most of modern history, Iran, or Persia as it was known then, was trapped. To the north, the Russian Empire, hungry for warm water, ports, and influence. To the south, the British Empire, obsessed with protecting the land route to India. Both empires carved out spheres of influence. Both extracted concessions, rights to build railroads, exploit resources, station troops. Persian kings played them against each other, but it was a losing game. The country was being slowly devoured. And then, in 1834, a different kind of foreigner arrived. American Presbyterian missionaries came with Bibles and medical supplies, not armies, not yet. They built schools in the northwest around a city called Omia. By 1895, they had established over 100 schools, educated thousands of students, and opened hospitals that served thousands of people. They weren't perfect. Missionary work never is, but they weren't there to conquer. They weren't demanding territorial concessions or exclusive trade rights. They were teaching, healing. To Iranians who had spent generations watching foreign powers carve up their homeland, America looked different. It looked honest. That reputation was about to be tested. In 1911, Persia was broke. The Constitutional Revolution of 1906 had created a parliament, but the country's finances were a disaster. Looted by corrupt officials, drained by foreign creditors, and hollowed out by decades of bad deals with Britain and Russia. The new constitutional government needed someone to fix things, someone honest, someone with no ties to imperial powers that had bled Persia dry. Then came this 35-year-old American lawyer called William Morgan Shuster. He had helped reorganize the customs service in the Philippines after the Spanish-American War. Now he was being offered something quite bigger: Treasurer General of Persia. He would have absolute authority over the country's finances. He arrived in May 1911 with a small team of American advisors. His mission was to root out corruption, collect taxes fairly, and break the stranglehold of foreign creditors. And here's the thing, he actually tried to do it. Shuster went after corrupt officials. He challenged British and Russian economic interests. He tried to create a modern tax system that would fund Persian sovereignty instead of foreign banks. London and St. Petersburg were furious. This American was interfering with their carefully constructed system of imperial exploitation. In December 1911, just 8 months after Shuster arrived, Russia issued an ultimatum to the Persian government: fire Shuster or face invasion. Persia's fragile democracy caved. Shuster was dismissed. He went home and wrote a book about this experience. He called it The Strangling of Persia. But even in failure, Shuster had proven something: Americans could be trusted. When given power, they used it to help and not exploit. That reputation would last for decades, and then it would be destroyed in just 48 hours. 30 years later, the world was at war and Iran suddenly mattered more than ever. After Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Stalin desperately needed American weapons, trucks, and supplies. But how do you get them there? The Arctic convoys were death traps. German submarines and aircraft turned them into floating graveyards. One convoy in 1942 lost 24 of 35 ships. The solution was a 1,000-mile supply line through a neutral country, Iran. It was called the Persian Corridor, and it became one of the most important logistics operations of the war. The United States deployed around 30,000 troops to Iran, but not to fight, but to move cargo. Thousands of aircraft passed through Iran to Soviet pilots waiting at the border. They built 200,000 trucks in Iranian factories. By the war's end, they had delivered 4.16 million long tons of supplies to the USSR. Historians estimate this supply route shortened the Eastern Front by at least a year. In November 1943, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met in Tehran, the first time all three leaders gathered in one place. They signed the Declaration of the Three Powers regarding Iran, guaranteeing the country's sovereignty and territorial integrity.
The docks at Bandar Shapur, once a small Iranian port, now a busy terminus, where one-time British railway vans and goods wagons carry British weapons and supplies from the Persian Gulf across Iran to the Caspian Sea.
America had arrived in Iran as an ally, a partner, a guarantor of independence. But the war also left something else behind, something that would soon change everything: oil.
In the barren, arid mountains of Khuzestan, in land where no crop would grow, in land that was just so much waste to Persia, British prospectors looked for oil, and only after 7 years did they find it in commercial quantities.
Iran's oil industry began in 1908 when a British prospector struck oil at Masjid Suleiman. It was the first major petroleum discovery in the Middle East, and Britain moved fast to control it. In 1914, Winston Churchill convinced the British government to buy a controlling 51% stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. This wasn't just business now, it was a strategy. The Royal Navy at the time was converting from coal to oil, and Churchill wanted a guaranteed supply. For the next 4 decades, British Petroleum, as it would eventually be known, extracted Iranian oil on terms that were, to put it mildly, unfavorable to Iran. Now, here are the numbers that would eventually start a revolution. You see, in 1947, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company reported after-tax profits of £40 million. That's about $112 million. Well, Iran's share of that money was just $7 million. That is 17.5%. Britain was taxing the oil company more than Iran earned in royalties from its own oil. British executives lived in air-conditioned compounds with swimming pools and golf courses. Iranian workers lived in slums without running water. The company refused to let Iran audit its books. It refused to train Iranian engineers for senior positions. It treated the country like a resource colony. The rage built slowly, quietly, until it found a voice. His name was Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh came from Persian aristocracy. His mother was a Qajar princess. He studied in France, earned a doctorate in Switzerland, and returned home to enter politics with one consistent message: Iran's resources belong to Iran. For years, he was a voice in the wilderness, a nationalist in a parliament dominated by foreign interests and corrupt elites. But by 1950, the public mood had shifted. People were tired of watching their wealth flow overseas. And so on March 15, 1951, the Iranian parliament voted to nationalize the oil industry. 6 weeks later, Mossadegh became prime minister. His mandate was clear: take back the oil.
One of his rare appearances, Mohammad Mossadegh, Premier of Iran, meets the press to reaffirm his government's unwillingness to arbitrate with Britain over nationalizing the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. With chances of a settlement fading, the West's best hope is that this sickly man, in whose frail hands may lie the key to peace, is as anti-Russian as he is anti-British.
At the United Nations, Mossadegh made Iran's case to the world, saying the petroleum industry has contributed nothing to the well-being of the people or to the technical progress or industrial development of his country. He was right, and Britain was furious. London's response was economic warfare. Britain froze Iran's sterling assets, banned exports to Iran, evacuated British oil technicians, making it nearly impossible to run the refineries. And they imposed a worldwide embargo on Iranian oil, threatening to sue any company that bought it. Iran's oil production collapsed. The economy staggered. But Mossadegh wouldn't bend. He was immensely popular. To ordinary Iranians, he wasn't just a politician. He was their champion against colonial humiliation, the man who finally said no. Britain tried to overthrow him alone in 1952. The plot failed. The operation was amateurish, and Mossadegh survived. But the British learned something important from that failure. They couldn't do this without America. Under President Truman, the United States had actually sympathized with Iran. American diplomats believed Mossadegh was a genuine nationalist, anti-communist, pro-democracy, someone the West could work with. And so they urged the Britain to negotiate. But in January 1953, everything changed. Dwight Eisenhower took office, and he brought with him two brothers who would reshape American foreign policy: John Foster Dulles at the State Department and Allen Dulles at the CIA. The Dulles brothers saw the world through one lens: communism. Every nationalist movement, every challenge to Western interest was a potential Soviet beachhead. British intelligence exploited this perfectly. They reframed the argument. Mossadegh isn't just a nationalist. He is weak. He's opening the door to the Tudeh party, Iran's communists. If he stays in power, Iran will fall to the Soviets. Well, this was a lie. Mossadegh had actually cracked down on the Tudeh, but in the paranoid atmosphere of early 1953, it was exactly what the Eisenhower administration wanted to hear. The decision was soon made, and they called it Operation Ajax. On April 4, 1953, CIA Director Allen Dulles approved $1 million, that is about 11 million in today's money, to be used in any way that would bring about the fall of Mossadegh. The man chosen to spend it was this guy, Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt. He was a senior CIA officer for the Near East Division. He was 37 years old, fluent in the region's politics, and about to become the architect of modern American intervention. On July 19, 1953, Roosevelt crossed into Iran under the alias James Lockridge. His mission was to coordinate with Iranian military officers, bribe key figures, and create the conditions for regime change. But first, he needed the Shah. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was 33 years old and terrified. He had inherited the throne from his father in 1941, and he had spent his reign in Mossadegh's shadow, a constitutional monarch with limited power, while the prime minister ran the country. The CIA needed him to sign royal decrees dismissing Mossadegh and appointing a new prime minister, General Fazlollah Zahedi, a military strongman willing to do Washington's bidding. Roosevelt met secretly with the Shah multiple times. The young monarch was indecisive, afraid of failure, afraid of Mossadegh's popularity. But eventually, under pressure from both the Americans and his own ambitious twin sister, Princess Ashraf, he agreed. The CIA plan had multiple parts, and all of them were designed to create chaos. First, propaganda. CIA operatives bribed newspaper editors to run stories attacking Mossadegh, calling him a communist sympathizer, a threat to Islam, a puppet of foreign powers. And second, the clergy. Some religious leaders were paid to denounce Mossadegh from the pulpit, warning that his secular nationalism threatened Islamic values. And third, the mobs. This is where it got ugly. CIA agents hired street gangs and toughs from South Tehran's poorest neighborhoods. They paid them to pose as student supporters, fake communists attacking mosques and religious figures, creating the impression that Iran was descending into leftist chaos. The strategy was psychological warfare. Make Iranians fear what Mossadegh represented, even if they had to manufacture the threat themselves. The first coup attempt came on the night of August 15th. Colonel Nasri, commander of the Imperial Guard, went to Mossadegh's house with a signed decree dismissing the prime minister. It should have been simple, but Mossadegh had been warned. His loyalists were waiting. So instead of arresting the prime minister, Nasri himself was arrested. The Shah panicked. He fled Iran, first to Baghdad, then to Rome, expecting never to return.
Attention is focused once again on the Middle East, where events in Iran have taken a dramatic double twist. Forced to flee his palace in Tehran, the Shah and his queen arrive in Rome after an alleged attempt by the Imperial Guard to arrest Dr. Mossadegh and a refusal by the Shah to dissolve parliament at Mossadegh's request.
Back in Tehran, crowds celebrated in the streets. Mossadegh appeared to have won. In Washington, CIA headquarters sent an urgent message to Kermit Roosevelt, quote, "Abort and flee." Roosevelt received this cable. He ignored it. 4 days later, Roosevelt tried again. On the morning of August 19th, paid mobs began assembling in the bazaars and slums of South Tehran. This time, they weren't pretending to be communists. They were pro-Shah, carrying pictures of the monarch, chanting nationalist slogans. Meanwhile, military units that had been bribed or pressured into supporting the coup began moving into position. Pro-Mossadegh officers were arrested or neutralized. By midday, Tehran was a war zone. Pro-Shah crowds attacked government buildings, newspaper offices, and the homes of Mossadegh supporters. Police and military units joined in or stood aside. By afternoon, tanks were surrounding Mossadegh's residence. The assault began.
300 killed and hundreds wounded is a conservative estimate. The rioters freed those taken prisoner earlier and stormed the house of Mossadegh.
His guards fought back, but they were overwhelmed. Between 200 and 300 people died in the streets of Tehran that day. Most of them were never identified. Mossadegh escaped over a garden wall in the chaos. He hid overnight, then surrendered the next day. His government was finished. On August 22nd, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi returned to Iran. The crowds that greeted him were smaller than the ones that had celebrated Mossadegh's apparent victory days earlier, but they were loud and they were on camera. When the Shah met Roosevelt, he knew exactly who had made this possible. Quote, "I owe my throne to God, my people, my army, and to you." Within 48 hours, the CIA delivered $5 million to the new government of General Zahedi. More would follow. Mossadegh was tried by a military court. He was charged with treason for trying to implement the policies that his own parliament had unanimously approved. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison, then house arrest for the rest of his life. He died in 1967 at 84, never having left his family estate. The government refused to allow a public memorial. 1 year after the coup, a new agreement was signed. Iran got the 50-50 profit sharing that Mossadegh had originally demanded from Britain, the deal they had refused to give him. But now, American companies owned 40% of that consortium. The coup hadn't just protected British oil interests, it had made room for American ones. The United States had overthrown a democracy to protect oil profits, and now they owned a king. But what they didn't realize was what this would create. The coup of 1953 didn't just change Iran's government, it changed what Iran would become. For 26 years after the coup, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi ruled Iran with absolute power, and for 26 years, the United States helped him keep it. In 1957, the CIA helped establish something called the SAVAK, Iran's new intelligence and security organization. Its official name meant Organization of Intelligence and National Security. Its unofficial purpose was quite simpler: to crush dissent. A 5-man CIA team spent approximately 6 years training the first generation of SAVAK personnel. They taught surveillance, interrogation, network infiltration, the full toolkit of political control. Later, Israel's Mossad took over training, adding their own expertise. By the 1970s, SAVAK employed between 4,000 and 6,000 full-time agents with thousands more informants. Their methods include electric shock, beatings, sleep deprivation, psychological torture. Political prisoners reached tens of thousands during the Shah's final years. The New York Times reported in 1978 that hundreds of Iranian security personnel were receiving training in the United States, techniques they would later use to torture protesters and crush dissent.
The physical torture went on, and the psychological torture was worse than physical torture. My own brother, a political prisoner, was taken once to this dark room and shown the mangled bodies of a few persons, and he was told that relatives of his, including his brother, including his mother and his father, were among the corpses.
Every Iranian knew someone who had been taken by SAVAK, a cousin who disappeared, a professor who never came back from questioning, a neighbor's son who came home broken. And so fear became the glue holding the Shah's regime together, and everyone knew who was behind it. But here's what makes the Shah's era so complicated. In 1963, the Shah launched what he called the White Revolution, a massive modernization program designed to transform Iran from a traditional society into a modern state. Land reform distributed property to 2.5 million farming families. Women got the right to vote. Literacy corps sent young men to villages as teachers. Free education was expanded. Healthcare reached rural areas for the first time. And the economy boomed. From 1960 to 1979, Iran's GDP grew to an average of 9.1% per year, one of the fastest rates in the developing world. In the 1960s alone, growth averaged 11.4%. Iran was building highways, dams, factories, universities. Then something dramatic happened.
The oil-producing countries of the Arab world decided to use their oil as a political weapon. They will reduce oil production by 5% a month until the Israelis withdraw from occupied territories.
In 1973, when OPEC quadrupled oil prices in response to the Arab-Israeli war, Iran's revenues exploded. Oil income jumped from $3.6 billion in 1972 to $17.8 billion by 1974 to 1975. By 1977, oil provided 79% of government revenue. The Shah went on a spending spree, not on his people but on weapons.
The Shah is generally accepted as having been a very repressive and oppressive ruler. His Savak tortured and killed. He lived in considerable splendor and opulence while there was terrible poverty in his country. In your book, Leaders, you write that he was not ruthless enough in quashing those who threatened his nation's stability.
Let's look at the Shah for just a moment and look at him very fairly. He actually was a progressive in a number of ways. He instituted a land reform program. He instituted a literacy program. He sent thousands of students from Iran to the United States, and particularly the United States, to study, and in other countries as well.
Under Nixon's Twin Pillars doctrine, Iran was supposed to be America's regional policeman in the Gulf. The Shah embraced the role with enthusiasm. Between 1970 and 1978, he ordered $20 billion worth of American weapons, the most rapid peacetime military buildup in world history. By the mid-1970s, 25,000 American military technicians were deployed in Iran just to maintain the equipment. And then there was the reckless spending on luxurious lifestyle. In October 1971, the Shah threw a party to celebrate 2,500 years of Persian monarchy. He held it at Persepolis, the ancient capital, and he spared no expense. Maxims of Paris catered the event. 60 heads of state attended. The wine list alone reportedly cost $2 million. The total cost was somewhere between tens to hundreds of millions of dollars. While royalty feasted on peacocks stuffed with foie gras, slums were spreading around Tehran. Inflation was rising. The gap between the oil-rich elite and everyone else was becoming wider. One man called this celebration what many Iranians felt it was, an orgy. His name was Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini.
Tonight, the man who could overthrow the Shah of Iran speaks from his headquarters in France.
Khomeini had been a thorn in the Shah's side for years. He opposed the White Revolution, especially land reform that weakened religious institutions and women's suffrage that challenged traditional Islamic authority. In 1963, after Khomeini publicly denounced the Shah as a Western puppet, the regime arrested him. Protests erupted. Hundreds were killed in the crackdown, and in 1964, Khomeini was exiled, first to Turkey, then to Iraq, and eventually to France. For 15 years, he waited and planned and built a network of followers who smuggled his sermons into Iran as cassette tapes. By 1977, the cracks were showing. Inflation soon hit 25%. Unemployment was rising. The Shah's modernization had created a massive urban middle class and educated population, exactly the groups most likely to demand political freedom. And Savak's repression was making enemies faster than it was eliminating threats. In December 1977, President Jimmy Carter visited Tehran and delivered a famous toast.
Iran, because of the great leadership of the Shah, is an island of stability in one of the more troubled areas of the world.
Well, he was wrong. Iran was a powder keg, and the fuse had already been lit. In January 1978, a government newspaper published an article attacking Khomeini. calling him a foreign agent and implying he was British. Religious students in the holy city of Qom took to the streets in protest. Security forces opened fire. Several were killed. In Shah Islam, there is a tradition of mourning 40 days after a death. So 40 days after the Qom killings, mourners gathered to commemorate the death and protested again. Security forces fired again. More martyrs, more mourning cycles, more protests. Each cycle was bigger than the last. The movement was feeding on itself. And then, on August 19, 1978, 25 years to the day after the CIA coup, disaster struck again. Someone had locked the doors of the cinema Rex in Abadan while a film was showing and set the building on fire. Between 377 and 470 people burned to death, one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in modern history at the time. The public blamed Savak. They believed the Shah's regime had massacred his own people to create an excuse for crackdown. The government blamed leftist agitators. Years later, evidence would suggest it was actually Islamic militants. But in the fever of 1978, it didn't matter. Trust was gone. And so on September 8th, Black Friday, soldiers opened fire on protesters in Tehran's Jaleh Square. The official death toll was 64 to 88. Rumors claimed thousands. The historian Evad Abrahamia called it, quote, a sea of blood between the Shah and the people. And then came December. On December 10th and 11th, 1978, the holy days of Tasu'a and Ashura, somewhere between 6 and 9 million Iranians marched against the Shah. That's more than 10% of the entire country, in the streets on 2 consecutive days. It may have been the largest protest event in human history. They were chanting for Khomeini, for an end to the monarchy, for an end to foreign interference. On January 16, 1979, the Shah left Iran. He told his prime minister, quote, I give Iran into your care, yours and God's. He would never return.
He said that even if he were, he expected either to be assassinated or to lead his country. But at 10 minutes to 10, Khomeini was being helped down the steps of his chartered Air France jet to set foot on Iranian ground for the first time in 15 years. The people were in a frenzy to catch just a glimpse of the man they revere like a god.
2 weeks later, on February 1st, Ayatollah Khomeini landed in Tehran on a chartered Air France 747. Millions came to welcome him. A journalist asked, quote, how do you feel about coming home after 15 years in exile? Khomeini's answer was chilling in its simplicity. Quote, nothing. On February 11th, the military declared neutrality. The Pahlavi dynasty, 2,500 years of Persian monarchy in its various forms, was finished. But the revolution wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The Islamic Republic of Iran was built on a single idea. The revolution was as much about America as it was about the Shah. To Khomeini and his followers, the Shah wasn't just a bad king, he was an American puppet. Savak wasn't just cruel, it was trained by the CIA. The whole 26-year Pahlavi regime was, in their telling, a foreign occupation dressed up as monarchy. And the United States Embassy in Tehran, that wasn't just a diplomatic mission. That was the den of spies.
Islamic students, militants, are angry with the American government over its support of the deposed Shah of Iran.
In October 1979, President Carter made a decision that would change history. The Shah, dying of cancer, needed advanced medical treatment. Against the advice of his own ambassador in Tehran, Carter agreed to let him into the United States. To revolutionary Iranians, this looked like history repeating itself. In 1953, the Shah had fled to Rome and the CIA had brought him back. Now he was in America. So was another restoration being planned? On November 4th, 1979, Iranian students stormed the US embassy. They called themselves, quote, the Muslim student followers of the Imam's line. Their demand was simple: send back the Shah to face trial for his crimes, extradite the dictator who had tortured their families, stolen their country's wealth, and ruled at America's pleasure. 66 Americans were taken hostage. 14 would eventually be released. 52 remained for 444 days.
The iconic image of the students parading their hostages before the media is replayed countless times to a country that feels it's being held hostage.
The morning that we were taken, they brought us out of the front of the embassy. There were thousands of people at this point in time.
For the next 14 and a half months, America watched. Every night, the news counted the days. Every night, Americans saw their compatriots blindfolded and humiliated. It was national trauma, televised, relentless, and deeply personal. President Carter froze roughly $8 billion in Iranian assets. He banned Iranian oil imports, severed diplomatic relations, but nothing worked. On April 24, 1980, Carter authorized a rescue mission called Operation Eagle Claw.
Late yesterday, I canceled a carefully planned operation which was underway in Iran to position our rescue team for a later withdrawal of American hostages.
8 helicopters and multiple C-130 transport planes would fly into the Iranian desert, stage overnight, then assault the embassy in Tehran. It was a disaster from the start. Dust storms damaged equipment. 3 helicopters developed mechanical problems. The mission was aborted at the staging area, but during the withdrawal, a helicopter collided with C-130. 8 American servicemen died in the Iranian desert. The helicopters and aircraft were abandoned. The Iranians displayed the wreckage on television. Khomeini called it divine intervention. The hostages were finally released on January 20th, 1981, minutes after Ronald Reagan was sworn in as president. It was Khomeini's final insult to Carter, timed perfectly for maximum humiliation. The 444 days destroyed Carter's presidency. They defined Iran as America's primary enemy, and they ensured that US-Iran relations would remain broken for decades. But the hostage crisis wasn't even the worst thing to happen to Iran in 1980. You see, on September 22nd, while the hostages were still being held, Saddam Hussein invaded Iran. He expected a quick victory. Iran's military had been gutted by revolutionary purges. Saddam calculated that the country would collapse in weeks. He was catastrophically wrong. The Iran-Iraq war lasted 8 years. It became one of the longest conventional wars of the 20th century and one of the deadliest. Around 500,000 people died, with Iran bearing the largest share. The economic cost exceeded $1 trillion for both sides combined. For Iran, already ravaged by revolution and isolated by the hostage crisis, the war was apocalyptic. And then there were the weapons. By 1983, Iraq was losing, so Saddam turned to chemical weapons, and the West helped him build them. German and American companies provided precursor chemicals, equipment, and technology. The Reagan administration, officially neutral, quietly tilted toward Iraq, sharing satellite intelligence on Iranian troop positions, facilitating arms sales through allies, and ensuring Saddam wouldn't lose. Iraq deployed mustard gas, tabun, sarin, and VX nerve agent on the battlefield. Iranian soldiers, lacking protective equipment, died in waves. Official Iranian data shows over 158,000 individuals were exposed to chemical weapons during the war. Mortality from mustard gas reached 30% in some sectors. The most infamous attack came on March 16, 1988, and it wasn't even against Iranian soldiers. Halabja was a Kurdish town in northern Iraq, near the Iranian border. Iraqi warplanes dropped a cocktail of mustard gas, sarin, tabun, and VX on the civilian population. Between 3,200 and 5,000 people died instantly, mostly women and children. Another 7,000 to 10,000 were injured. Survivors suffered blindness, burns, neurological damage, and lifelong trauma. It remains the largest chemical weapon attack on a civilian population in modern history. The UN documented Iraq's use of chemical weapons but took no meaningful action. The United States blocked resolutions that would have specifically named Iraq as the aggressor. And then on July 3, 1988, came an event that seared itself into Iranian memory.
Good afternoon from New York, where there is more on the downing of Iran Air Flight 655.
Iranian Air Flight 655 was a civilian passenger flight from Tehran to Dubai. It was flying in a commercial air corridor, climbing to its assigned altitude, broadcasting the correct transponder codes. The USS Vincennes, an American guided missile cruiser engaged in combat with Iranian naval vessels, identified the Airbus as a potential threat. The captain ordered 2 missiles fired. All 290 people aboard were killed. President Reagan called it, quote, a proper defensive action. The captain received a medal. The United States never formally apologized. 6 weeks later, Khomeini accepted a ceasefire with Iran. He called it more deadly than taking poison. The Iran-Iraq war ended with no territorial changes, no reparations, and 500,000 people dead. Iran's economy was shattered. Its cities were rubble. A generation was traumatized. But the war had one unexpected effect. It forged a population hardened by suffering and convinced now more than ever that the West was the enemy. The story of Iran after 1988 is one of an economy being systematically strangled by sanctions, war, mismanagement, and by choices made decades ago in Washington and London. From 1960 to 1979, under the Shah, Iran's GDP grew at 9.1% per year. In the 1960s alone, growth averaged 11.4%. Iran was industrializing, urbanizing, modernizing its economy. Whatever the Shah's crimes, the economy was roaring. But from 1979 to 2020, after the revolution, average GDP growth collapsed to 1.9% per year, an 80% drop in the growth rate. American sanctions began the day after the hostage crisis. The asset freeze that is still technically in effect, but they have grown into something far more comprehensive. 1984, Iran was designated a state sponsor of terrorism. 1996, the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act, the first secondary sanctions targeting foreign companies that do business with Iran. 2006 to 2020, 4 UN Security Council resolutions imposing multilateral sanctions. 2012, Iranian banks disconnected from SWIFT, that is, the global financial messaging system. Iran's oil exports dropped by 1.4 million barrels per day. The rial lost 80% of its value in months. These weren't just inconveniences. They were economic warfare designed to make Iran's government choose between its policies and its people's survival. In 2015, it looked like there might be a way out. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, was the most significant diplomatic breakthrough in decades. Iran agreed to cap uranium enrichment, reduce its stockpile, and accept intrusive inspections. And in exchange, it got relief from sanctions and access to roughly $100 billion in frozen assets. For a brief moment, this worked. Oil exports rebounded. GDP jumped 12.5% in 2016. Foreign investment trickled in. Hope flickered. Then, on May 8, 2018, President Trump announced that the United States was withdrawing from that deal. He called it, quote, maximum pressure. the most aggressive sanctions regime ever imposed on a country. Iran's oil exports fell to around 500,000 barrels per day, a fraction of their peak. The rial collapsed again from around 34,000 per dollar to over 1 million per dollar. Iran's usable foreign reserves collapsed as sanctions locked much of its money overseas. On January 3, 2020, a US drone strike killed Qasem Soleimani, commander of the Revolutionary Guards Quds Force and the second most powerful man in Iran. Millions of Iranians mourned. Iran retaliated with missiles at Al-Assad air base in Iraq and accidentally shot down a Ukrainian airliner in the chaos, killing 176 civilians. The cycle of escalation continued. And in 2025, it got worse. US forces struck 3 major Iranian nuclear sites in June 2025 amid escalating conflict with Israel. In September 2025, the US triggered a UN sanctions snapback, reactivating international restrictions that had been suspended under the JCPOA. In January 2026, the European Union designated Iran's Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist organization. The wars are closing in, and inside Iran, the people are paying the price. Inflation has run between 40 and 46% annually since 2021. Food prices rose by 72% in December 2025 alone. The rial hit a record low of 1.42 million per dollar, a currency that once traded at 70 to the US dollar in 1979. More than 30% of Iranians live below the poverty line. Roughly 60 million people now depend on government subsidies to survive. Meat and cooking oil have become unaffordable for many families. The educated are leaving. Over 50,000 students emigrate every year. The brightest minds, doctors, engineers, scientists, are building their futures anywhere but home. All of this resulted in the protest that started in December 2025. Now, here's the tragedy. Iran possesses 9% of the world's proven oil reserves, the 4th largest on earth. It holds 18% of global natural gas reserves. Its petrochemical industry produces 100 million tons annually. The wealth is there. It's always been there. But Iranians can't access it, blocked by sanctions, mismanagement, and a political system that prioritizes survival over prosperity. The Revolutionary Guards now control an estimated 40% of Iran's economy, a shadow empire of construction, telecommunications, and import-export that answers to no one. Religious foundations called bonyas hold vast assets outside public accountability. On August 19, 1953, the CIA spent less than $1 million to overthrow a democracy. 70 years later, that $1 million has multiplied into trillions of dollars in economic damage. Hundreds of thousands of lives lost in war, millions living in poverty, a nation frozen in a cycle of hostility that neither side seems able to break. For Americans, Iran is the hostage crisis, the death to America chance, the nuclear threat, the terrorist proxies. These are real concerns. But for Iranians, America is the 1953 coup that killed their democracy, the Savak torturers trained by the CIA, the warship that shot down Flight 655 without apology, the sanctions that collapsed their currency and emptied their hospitals of medicine. Both narratives are true. Neither side can escape the history they made together. Kermit Roosevelt is dead, so are the Shah, Khomeini, and Mossadegh. But the policies they made and the resentments they created, they all live on. And you can hear it in the chants on the street as people continue to bleed and cry for a change.